You already beat him once, didn't you? This should be a cinch.
Yeah.
Cloud, you know what I told you.
That's right. I am your living legacy.
When I think back on the many different consoles that I've owned over the years, I think the one that I have the fondest memories of is the PlayStation Portable. The handheld system was launched back while I was still in high school, where I bought one off a friend and it became a constant companion for me for years, even into my young adulthood, as one of my workmates got us all playing Monster Hunter with him. It was an impressive little system for the time, and it spawned quite a few pretty damn good games during its life cycle, with classics like Ready at Dawn's Daxter, my favourite God of War game, Ghost of Sparta, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, and how could I forget the most important game, Dead or Alive Paradise.
That can't be right!
There were also some ambitious PS2 ports too, like Tomb Raider Legend for example. However, there was one PSP game for me, and I'm certain a lot of other people, that left a big impact on me, and that was SquareEnix's 2008 Final Fantasy VII prequel, Crisis Core. The game was produced as part of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, which included other media such as the 2005 film sequel, Advent Children, and was a celebration for the 10-year anniversary of the beloved 1997 PS1 classic, Final Fantasy VII. It's a game that struck a major chord with me, and it's probably my favourite entry in the entire franchise, alongside Final Fantasy XV, which is probably the most controversial thing I will say in this video.
If it were, your brother would kick my ass.
Crisis Core follows the story of soldier Zack Fair, a very minor character from the original PS1 game. Beginning 7 years prior to the events of Final Fantasy VII, the story expands upon many characters and events that informed the original story, particularly the tragic love story between Zack and Aerith, the downfall of Sephiroth and his descent into madness, and Zack's ultimate sacrifice to save Cloud Strife. It's one of the better prequels I've experienced, as the story does enrich the original game in a lot of ways, along with some not so subtle fan service. You get to see a very different side to the villain Sephiroth, almost a bit like Anakin in the Clone Wars. And the iconic opening shot of Aerith from the original Final Fantasy VII is given more depth as you learn that Aerith was terrified of the sky as a teenager and had never ventured above the plate covering the Midgar slums, recontextualizing the original shot as a bigger character moment for her than we were aware of.
Not quite what I expected.
The quality of the presentation was absolutely striking for the time, especially considering this was running on the PSP, with very detailed looking character models and great animation work throughout, particularly during the many fight scenes. It used many memory saving tricks common at the time, like swapping out the gameplay models for high detail models during big cutscenes, something you can also see being done in Final Fantasy X. The environments, however, were a bit on the simplistic side and suffered from some low quality texture work in places, a downside of the PSP's hardware limitations, but for the most part it remains a very attractive looking game for a handheld console.
So pretty.
The gameplay was quite a departure for the series, moving away from the turn-based RPG style of other games and into more of an action-driven hack and slash, whilst retaining many core mechanics of the series. Given the control layout of the PSP, having only one analog stick and 2 shoulder buttons, there is a little bit of clunkiness as you use the shoulder buttons to cycle through your different materia abilities while engaging in combat. There was no designated attack button, as square was used to dodge, triangle for blocking, and circle for closing the item menu, so the combat can feel a bit stilted at first, but honestly, once you get used to it, the game becomes remarkably fluid given the restraints of the control layout for the PSP.
Activating combat mode.
Probably the most unique part of Crisis Core's gameplay is its DMW system, which is essentially a slot machine mechanic that is always in play during combat, and is tied to both your limit break attacks and leveling up your materia and Zack's overall level. For the limit break attacks, if the DMW lands on 3 matching character images, it then triggers the corresponding limit break attack assigned with that character. Each DMW spin also has numbers that can grant different buff effects based on what the combination is that they land on, but these numbers are also tied to your materia slots, and if the DMW stops with 2 matching characters and 2 numbers matching a slot with materia equipped, it is leveled up and then becomes stronger. And if the DMW lands on 777, Zack's overall level is increased, which makes the combat feel a bit more unpredictable. The randomness of Zack leveling can be a bit annoying, as you can sometimes go long periods without him leveling up, but then the reverse can also happen where Zack will level up twice in one battle, which can be pretty funny.
Overconfidence will destroy you.
Outside of the main story, there was also an extensive list of optional missions to do that unlocked rare items, but were designed with the PSP's portable nature in mind, as these missions are all bite-sized bits of action that you could play whilst commuting on a train without having to worry about the story. There are some odd quirks to the design of Crisis Core, but as a whole, it was a remarkable game and a beautiful story expansion to Final Fantasy VII that it's not hard to see why it was so revered and beloved by fans.
Me? Gungaga.
Unfortunately, however, Crisis Core was one of many games that was left behind in abandonware purgatory after the PSP was discontinued, as it never received a PS3 port like God of War Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta, and there was never a digital release of the game, meaning that for many years the only way to play Crisis Core was to track down a second-hand copy and console, or resort to emulation.
Easy to make that promise.
When the remake of Final Fantasy VII became a reality in 2020, I began to wonder about the prospect and likelihood of Crisis Core being remastered after all this time, though doubt started to creep in as I played through FF7 Remake and noticed how much had been changed and expanded with the story, that I speculated that Crisis Core might get retconned and reimagined in a later installment of the remake project. So it was quite a welcome surprise when a remaster, titled Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, was officially announced back in June, finally rescuing the game from abandonware hell, and with a new coat of paint updating it for modern audiences. Now that the game is finally released just in time for Christmas, and having played through it myself, this is one of the more interesting games I've played this year, especially in terms of the fan reactions, and there's quite a bit to discuss with this remaster. So let's take a look at the Reunion, shall we?
You fell from the sky.
Huh?
Scared me.
Crisis Core Reunion is another one of these remaster remake titles, very similar to the Shadow of the Colossus remake from 2016 and the Demon's Souls remake from 2021, where the game is rebuilt largely from the ground up, but keeps the gameplay experience almost entirely intact. Now running on the Unreal 4 engine, Crisis Core Reunion has been a joint project between SquareEnix and developers Tosei, as I imagine that SquareEnix is pouring most of its in-house resources into Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. Developers Tosei actually made the infamous Resident Evil Survivor for the PS1, and thankfully they've come a long way since then.
What?
Unlike the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was a complete reimagining, Crisis Core Reunion is pretty much a one-to-one remake of the original PSP game, with the same basic framework used. All of the levels are identical to the original, and the story is exactly the same, outside of some minor aesthetic and dialogue changes. But there is a really profound difference in the visuals, as to be expected. The environments now boast a much greater level of geometrical complexity in a lot of different areas, and much richer looking texture work, along with much better shadows and lighting in the outdoor areas, and interior areas now feature some rather attractive screen space reflections. There are definitely some assets that have been repurposed from the FF7 remake, particularly in the Sector 5 slums, where the massive skybox texture of the Midgar plate is the same between both games. The outside of Aris Church now looks very similar to FF7 Remake too, and really impressive when you compare it to the original.
Whew. That was unexpected.
All of the characters have been updated with much higher polygon counts, and brings the game closer to the more stylized realism look of Square Enix's more recent games. And when you do the comparisons between the original game and Reunion, the differences really are night and day. It's quite a drastic visual upgrade when compared to some of SquareEnix's other remaster efforts, like Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, where the visual updates were a bit subtler, but still attractive, making the effort poured into the Crisis Core Reunion all the more impressive.
Beautiful.
However, there are aspects of the visuals that feel a bit lacking when you compare it not just to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but also Final Fantasy XV. The character models lack the more refined shader work on textures, and the hair lacks the finer details that can be seen in VII Remake, and more surprisingly, Final Fantasy XV, which came out in 2016.
It's even more beautiful out here at night.
The animation work seen throughout the game is, by and large, identical to the original, so the bigger action cutscenes still look really fluid, but the many dialogue scenes that weren't originally voiced feature very simple and often stiff-looking animations. Some of the outdoor areas in Reunion 2 I also feel don't hold up as well to Final Fantasy XV, where you can see just a much greater foliage density and ambient occlusion shadows along the ground. The water shading also looks a bit bland by comparison too, which is interesting. These are fairly minor gripes, mind you, and depend on your perspective knowledge. If you're familiar with what Crisis Core used to be, the visuals will impress a lot more than they will disappoint.
No. It looks good, really.
As I mentioned earlier, the controls of Crisis Core on PSP were functional and based on the limitations of the console, but with Reunion, the controls have been revamped and the combat has been reworked slightly, bringing it a bit closer in feel to the VII Remake, along with a new user interface that looks very similar. There is now a designated attack button, and all of your materia abilities are now simple button combos linked to L1, while cycling through healing items is done with R2 and L2. It makes combat feel so much more fluid and faster, and as such, the game has also been rebalanced to compensate for this. Reunion is definitely a bit harder than the original, and there's now a power mechanic for boss enemies' limit attacks, where you can reduce the damage they inflict or cancel them entirely if you're strong enough. This increased difficulty is noticeable early on in the game, as I died a lot more than I did during my PSP playthrough, but it becomes a bit of a non-issue if you do a bunch of the optional missions and unlock some of the rarer materia these unlock. I also really like how you can actually see how many chests are in the missions and what the reward is. Once you combine some of these rare materia using the game's materia fusion mechanic, the game almost becomes broken by how ridiculously overpowered you can make Zack, leading to some amusing ludo-narrative dissonance where I defeated Sephiroth in about 30 seconds.
How dare you?
There are a few quality of life improvements added to the game, offering a lot more hints regarding how to unlock various different upgrades and guidance on how to complete certain quest lines that were a bit cryptic in the original. Like, there's a quest that revolves around you gathering materials to build flower wagons for Aerith, and some of these materials can only be won by taking part in a squat competition that unlocks after Chapter 5.
Treasure quest failed.
You still might want to refer to a guide, however, if you're going after all the achievements here, as there is a lot of missable content scattered throughout the game, like the 7 Wonders in Nibelheim, where one of the summon materials is hidden. From a visual and gameplay standpoint, this remaster of Crisis Core is phenomenal to play, and all of the changes work really well to update the experience of the game that I loved from way back, and is a great way for new players to finally experience the story without needing to deal with emulation and the more outdated aspects of the original game's design.
I'm just kidding. You know I wouldn't do that to you. We're friends, right?
But this is where I need to address the elephant in the room, and if you've been paying attention to the discourse surrounding Crisis Core Reunion, then you know what I'm about to get into. Yeah, so they censored the outfit that Tifa wears in this remaster. I kid, that's a real non-issue, although I was confused that they censored Genova's head when Sephiroth finally meets his mother.
Mother schmother. It's Genova's friggin' head.
The real dark cloud that has been hanging over this remaster project for a lot of fans of the original PSP game has been the new voice actors for the characters, with one character in particular. And a lot of this has to do with some really strong nostalgia, there's no denying that. The original Final Fantasy VII released on the PlayStation in 1997, and all of the dialogue was delivered through text, meaning that players at the time would have had different imaginings of the voices, much like when you read a comic book. However, when the movie sequel Advent Children released in 2005, all of these characters found their definitive voices, and these actors would go on to reprise the roles over the next decade in various other games like Dirge of Cerberus, Kingdom Hearts, and Dissidia. They became the voices the fans associated with these characters.
Sorry that it took me so long.
It's alright.
It was surprising then that when the Final Fantasy VII Remake project came along, none of these actors returned to reprise the roles, and they were all replaced by a brand new cast. Thankfully though, the majority of these new voices sounded similar enough that the difference wasn't that big a deal.
Really?
I mean, why not? It'll be fun.
Do you even have fancy clothes?
Not like fancy, but I'll figure something out.
For me personally, Sephiroth was a bit hit and miss in places, but in the case of Brianna White, I think she has become the definitive version of Aerith.
Easy now.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit.
Unfortunately, in the case with Zack, the reception to his new voice actor, Caleb Pierce, was a lot more mixed. It seems a lot of the newer Final Fantasy VII audience is very receptive to him, but for many older fans, myself included, yeah, his voice just really isn't that great.
What the hell did you do, Angeal? Is that your idea of honor?
What the hell did you do, Angeal? Is that your idea of honor?
Working for Hollander now? What is it you're after?
World domination.
That's not even funny, man.
Working for Hollander now? What is it you're after?
World domination.
That's not even funny, man.
Hey, Cisne. Been a while.
Hey, Cisne. Been a while.
So, Cisne, you're here to take us back, right?
So, Cisne, you're here to take us back, right?
Okay. I'll come visit.
I'll be here.
Okay. I'll come visit.
I'll be here.
I think it's fine. It's all about the flowers anyway.
I think it's fine. It's all about the flowers anyway.
A tiny little wish. That's all.
They're tiny, but you have lots, right?
A tiny little wish. That's all.
They're tiny, but you have lots, right?
I will find them before they do.
And what?
It's not the worst voice acting I've heard. I'd probably give that dishonor to Sam Riegel's Peter Parker in the Amazing Spider-Man games. But this new high-pitched, slightly nasally sounding voice I just really think does not suit Zack, and often at times can make him sound a bit like a hyperactive child. Which, to be fair, he kind of is at the start of the game, as he's only 16, and a bit like Tom Holland's Peter Parker with his dream of being a hero.
Mako?
Hey, check it out. Marco!
Really?
But as the dark events of the story unfold, Zack is forced to grow up and mature really quickly as the weight of all these tough responsibilities are placed on him, and the original voice actor, Rick Gomez, captured this growth pretty damn close to perfectly. His voice was at just the right register to convey the giddy and somewhat aloof teenage Zack, and then the battle-hardened and thoughtful mentor that he ends up becoming to Cloud. Part of this less favourable reception to the new voice reminds me of the reaction to Peter Parker's face redesign in Insomniac's Spider-Man, where many felt the new face made Peter look too young, especially since he's meant to be a mentor figure for Miles Morales, but now they look the same age. It echoes this situation here with Crisis Core Reunion, that Caleb's high-pitched voice just makes Zack sound too young for a character that's meant to have such a mentor-like essence to his character. Compare this scene here with Cloud and Zack talking about Tifa, and how the different voice tones affect the scene.
By the way, do you know Tifa?
Sort of.
Talk to her?
No.
I'm sensing some issues here. Shouldn't you do something?
By the way, do you know Tifa? Sort of. Talk to her? No. I'm sensing some issues here. Shouldn't you do something?
I also found the fact that they changed one of Cloud's lines in this scene ruined the original intent of the scene.
You know, I've never actually seen you use that.
Hey, Zack. You know, I've never seen you use that.
Hey, Zack. I really like that sword. It's impressive.
It's not awful, and there were a couple of scenes where he sounded good. Thankfully, one of them was the ending, but yeah, when you put the two voices next to each other, the difference is very noticeable, and more often not for the better. And the thing that I think could have been done to alleviate this backlash would have been to just simply add the option to play through the game with the original dub for the older fans, as after all, the subtitle is Reunion. I can sort of see why they didn't do that, as in the original game, a lot of the dialogue was still delivered through text, whereas here in the remaster, all of the dialogue has been voiced. But honestly, I think fans of the original likely wouldn't have minded this at all, and it would have been really easy to do as all of the original voice acting is still in the game's code, as confirmed in this scene that has now been patched, where Zack's original voice can be heard.
He's the other sample they collected at Nibelheim.
Why did you come here? I told you to go away!
The one saving grace of this information, however, is that because all of the voices are still in the code, a mod that restores them will not be too far away for people playing on PC, and my inevitable next playthrough of Crisis Core Reunion will be the PC version.
But I still can't get used to it.
At the end of the day, however, for as much as I may not like the new voice for Zack, at its core, Reunion is still that amazing PSP game that I loved all those years ago, and it really does feel good to know that the game is no longer lost to emulation and eBay listings, and that it's received a lot of love in this new remastered Reunion. The gameplay touches added and the impressive new visuals that bring it closer to the Final Fantasy VII Remake make it feel like a necessary addition to the Final Fantasy VII mythos again, and I'll be honest, when I finished Reunion, I felt an incredibly strong urge to replay Final Fantasy VII Remake. With that all said, I hope you've enjoyed my piece on Crisis Core and this Reunion remaster. Let me know in the comments what you think of it, or Final Fantasy in general. Are you a fan of Final Fantasy XIII perchance? As always, thank you for watching. You can support the channel further on Patreon, and until next time, stay safe out there these holidays, buy some flowers from that flower girl, and I'll see you all in the next video.